Thank you, Hans. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's better if I do the talk in English because my English is better, and it would be rather silly if I'm speaking Chinese and then it's retranslated back into English. I'm also a little nervous, and I think there's a phrase in Chinese, is it banmen nongfu, when you're kind of sitting in front of specialists talking about your research, but the people that I read in order to do the research are sitting kind of mostly on this side and in the back. So if I say anything wrong or my research doesn't seem as advanced as it should be, people will tell me afterwards. I'm trying to conceive of a different way of thinking about post-war Japanese history, because I think for a long time, modern Japanese history has been put in a corner, kind of a ghetto by itself. And I think if we think about the end of the war in a different way than perhaps the American-centered John Dower occupation of Japan by the Americans, if we shift away from that and recenter East Asia by itself and think about relationships between Japan and China in the immediate post-war, that we get a very different picture of what was happening in East Asia. So as a Japanologist, I'm very interested in the way in which post-war China has influenced modern Japan. Within that framework, I think we have to take a look again at the periphery of the Japanese empire. In the generally American-dominated understanding of post-war Japanese history, there is no empire all of a sudden on August 15, 1945. We talk about repatriation, we talk about Japanese coming back from the edges of the empire, but always back to Japan, which is placed in the center. And what we have forgotten about is how power, authority, and that struggle over command and control at the edge of where the Japanese used to rule in China, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, in Eastern India, what happened there, and how those struggles and how those conflicts had an impact back on the rest of East Asia. So for me, the question is, what happens at the end of when the Japanese empire falls, and what sort of impact does this have not only on Japan, but in the rest of East Asia? And I think particularly when we look at the Chinese case, it's a very different story than the rest of the Japanese empire. Because actually, when we read the diaries of people like the last Japanese commanding general in China, Okumura Yasuji, and Gangzu Ningci, for, just to give the translators help in his name in Chinese, because I always get confused. He says in his diary, "We didn't lose to the Chinese. We never lost. It's only the Americans who helped the Chinese win." And I think that attitude of the Japanese military in areas outside of American control really gives us a very different understanding and image, again, of that struggle in China to replace the Japanese as the dominant power. I think in particular where I've been looking in the last few years, in a recent book that I just published called Men to Devils, Devils to Men, is in the war crimes trials that took place all over East Asia. Many of you are probably extremely familiar with the Nuremberg trials, the A-class Nuremberg trials in Germany, and of course, the Tokyo war crimes trial, A-class war crimes trial. But what we haven't paid much attention to over the succeeding years since the end of the war are the BC class war crimes trials. And just to remind us of the difference in scale, in the Tokyo war crimes trial, there are originally 28 defendants. That gets whittled down to 25. And those are the people who are held entirely responsible for Japan's wars in East Asia. With the BC class war crimes trials, we are talking about 5,700 individuals in 49 different venues all over East and Southeast Asia. So the scale, the difference is immense. Within China alone, we are looking at close to 1,000 individuals in 10 different venues all throughout China, including Taiwan. At the same time that we're thinking about what were the Chinese trying to do in rectifying the problems caused by the Japanese imperial military in China. And here I'd like us to focus or think differently about the end of the war on the legal side. We've often recently bandied about the term transitional justice. How do countries after a civil war or after a war reestablish justice? But for me, the issue is not one of transitional justice in East Asia, but of competitive justice. And let me just paint you a quick picture, again, why I think we need to move away from this American-centered understanding of East Asian history and toward an East Asian-centered one. Competitive justice can help explain what's happening in East Asia by thinking about who is trying to regain or assert power in the first place. In China alone, we have 4 major groups that are vying for control. We have, of course, the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. We have the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong. We have the American military, which very quickly sends in about 80,000 US Marines. And we have, lastly, a group that we often forget about, the Japanese former imperial military itself, which arguably has not ever lost a major victory in China, but also still remains there as it slowly repatriates. But it does so slowly, so slowly, in fact, that many of the allies continue to use the Japanese imperial forces throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia to continue to maintain public order. So the Japanese, outside of Japan, in their former empire, are still a very viable authority that the re-entering former European colonial powers and the Americans and the CCP and the KMT will also use to their own advantage in order to establish command and control. Within this conflict of 4 major parties in China attempting to gain control, what better method, what better theater than to use the new and expanding idea of international law in a court recognized by the Allies to try Japanese war crimes, to demonstrate to your domestic population that not only do you understand the new tool and the basis of what is the pursuit of justice, you can show it to your people and you can also show it internationally. Think of what's happening in China up until 1943. It is a country divided by colonial law in which, in many major urban areas, China does not celebrate its own sovereignty of law. It has to deal with extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality is thrown out in 1943, but in 1945, internationally, China is not respected in the court of law. So China is facing on many fronts, domestically and internationally, that it has to prove itself. And again, what better way to prove itself internationally than to demonstrate to the other allies that China knows how to pursue justice against the Japanese invaders. And that is precisely what it does from 1946 to 1949 in 10 venues throughout China. And those are the Chinese nationalist trials. I think it's important to remember that Chiang Kai-shek uses the phrase August 14, 1945, 以德报怨, which I would translate as to repay malevolence with benevolence. we'll see in a few minutes that Mao Zedong will also do the same thing. But this is very important for the Chinese nationalists. They do gain some international recognition in their pursuit of justice against the Japanese, but they are not going to pursue revenge. And for me, this is an important ideal that they pursue, going back to the words of Hans in the introduction. In one way, the Chinese put an impediment, an obstacle to this cycle of violence in East Asia that has really been continuing since the late 1920s. In the trials, there are many ups and downs. If you want to get full insights, you can read them in some books that have come out recently in English, but also obviously in Japanese and some in Chinese. I will point out one fact, though, that the very last trial the KMT holds in January of 1949 is the trial of Okumura Yasuji. He is found not guilty, and many people at the time were wondering why. If you read Judge Shirmeyu's diary at the time, it seems that Chiang Kai-shek wanted to have an exchange with Okumura Yasuji. And that exchange comes through later on in late 1949, when the KMT flees to Taiwan and then establishes an illegal liaison between the KMT military and former Japanese imperial officers who form something called Baituan, the White Group. And the White Group goes and trains KMT military officers for the next 20 years. So in many ways, the shape and color of war crimes trials between the KMT and the Japanese has a lasting legacy on Chinese nationalist, Japanese relations, at least up until the late 1960s, if not the 1970s. On the other side of the platform is, of course, the CCP trials. Many people might know those a little better in mainland China. The CCP is in a quandary. It's stuck in 1949 because the KMT has repatriated all the Japanese war criminals. The KMT was worried that the CCP would get its hands on Japanese war criminals and hold its own war crimes trials. And again, we go back to this idea of competitive justice, that even long after World War II is over in East Asia, the Chinese Communist Party wants to be able to demonstrate not only domestically to its population, but also, much more importantly, internationally, because in 1949 and 1950, the CCP's international friends are few and far between. What better way in 1949 and 1950 to show that it's really the Chinese Communist Party that understands justice than to, again, look to hold war crimes trials of Japanese war criminals. However, there is one big problem. There are none left really in China. And here the Soviet Union steps in to fill the gap. Stalin, in recently translated telegrams and documents, essentially says to Mao, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we didn't support you in 1945 when we made a peace treaty with the Chinese nationalists. And he literally says, in meetings with Mao, as a token of my apology, I would like to gift you 1,000 Japanese, they call them war criminals, you can call them prisoners of war, gives them to the communist government. And at first, Mao says, no, don't give them to us yet, we're not ready to receive them. And they kind of try to push back as long as possible, because as Mao says in his own writings, the Chinese Communist Party has not renovated its system of justice yet. It is not prepared to hold trials. The Soviets keep pressing. Eventually, the 1,000 Japanese prisoners are transferred to Chinese custody. And 6 years later, in the late summer of 1956, the Chinese communists will hold their own war crimes trials in two major venues in Taiyuan in Shanxi province and in Shenyang up in Liaoning province. The big difference between the two sets of trials is that the KMT trials almost have little impact in Japan after the war. Most of those individuals go back into Japanese society. The CCP trials, in a sense, create an entirely new lobbying force in China. The men who are re-educated and have to admit their crimes over a series of years. We could talk about the issue of brainwashing later on. I tend to disagree with that assessment. These men go back to Japan, they set up a lobbying group, and they are among the first groups in Japan to press the Japanese population to think about wartime responsibility. It's an interesting moment in the 1950s because if we look at Japan, it's struggling with its own social discussion about war crimes and war responsibility. And I'd like to use the last few minutes to really talk about the Japanese case, because here I think we can begin to see some of the influence that what's happening in China at the end of the war is not only limited to China, but it has an impact on the legacy of war memory back in Japan. And there we have two groups in Japan. On one side, we have those men who were tried by the Chinese nationalists between 1946 and 1949. They basically go back, they complain about the trials having not followed the letter of the law, and they complain about low-level soldiers being victims of the war and being victims of the Chinese. And in part, that group builds a statue called the Love Statue in front of Tokyo Station. They press a book in 1954 called Last Will and Testaments of all the unfairly executed soldiers throughout the 49 different trial venues in East Asia. And that has a long-lasting effect on the way in which Japanese society will conceive and think of the pursuit of justice, or the unfair pursuit of justice, in post-war China. On the other side in Japan, we have the Chukiren. We have this group of former soldiers that were tried by the communists in 1956. Not one of them was executed. A majority of them are sent back in 1956 and 1957, and the last one of them is repatriated in 1964. Now, until recently, my story would end here, but since I see on my clock that I have 2 minutes left in Hans's ferocious timekeeping manner, I would just like to add one fact, something that's coming out more recently, which is, if you're only thinking about Japanese history and Chinese history in a country-specific way, then you wouldn't continue to really dig further. But the interesting fact is that the repatriation of former war criminals in China to their home countries doesn't end with the Japanese in 1964. It ends in 1975, 11 years after the last Japanese was sent home. And if you're wondering who those individuals were, they were in fact former KMT war criminals. The Chinese Communist Party keeps a hold longer of its closer brethren, the Chinese nationalists, than it does the Japanese. And in fact, those last 10 who tried to repatriate from Beijing through Hong Kong to Taiwan in 1975 are rejected at the last moment. So again, part of what my research has been looking at is, I think we need to move beyond our rather perhaps overly defined understanding of nationalist identity, be it communist, be it Chinese nationalist, or be it Japanese, and think about the pragmatics of the pursuit of justice, or the way in which justice is pursued in East Asia, and how that has shaped the political contours of East Asia over the last 70 years. Thank you very much.